Today's daf we're going to be learning is Makkot Daf Kaf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of David's father, Dr. Abraham Geffen, on his 10th yahrzeit. He was the youngest of 8 children of Rav Tuvia and Sarah Hannah Geffen of Atlanta and was devoted to his wife Ethel, his 3 children, as well as his parents, siblings, and extended family, synagogue community, Beth El of New Rochelle. He was a dedicated physician, director of radiology at Beth Israel Medical Center in New York for many, many years. Okay, with that, we will get started. Before we start, a few short announcements. One is there's some new material on the site that I haven't yet mentioned, so I'm going to mention it better late than never. Daf Yomi went up today, this week, about Makkot. In general, the idea of Makkot, is this a good thing? Is it not a good thing? Would we want to have lashes? Which you probably say no, but they actually suggest some positive reasons to maybe want to have Makkot in the courts. Geffen went up already a few days ago about Bria. We talked about that complete item, right? And all sorts of like an interesting chloket relating to the whole how we look at a complete item. And also Din and Daf came up about Lavani Takla say last week's topic. And remind me, did I forget? Right, Shuli Mishkin's article last week, that was about lashes. Yeah, about lashes. Okay, so a lot of interesting things if you have time and you want to delve in more. Okay, last announcement is the Siyum Friday. We're almost done with Masechet Makkot. So looking forward to see you there. We're doing it at the regular Zoom time. So anyone who's available and wants to join, great. Otherwise, you'll be able to get the shiur after like every day. Okay, we're going to get started with this concept. We're going to jump around again, different topics here about lashes. Right now, we're talking about someone who creates an incision in their body, makes a cut out of a mourning practice, okay, which is forbidden. We darshaned a few things at the end of yesterday's daf and then got to a bit of a problem because we darshaned 2 things from one pasuk. One is if you lacerate yourself because you are upset about something else, but not because you're mourning a dead body, a dead person. So you would not be liable lashes, and that they get from the word lenefesh, seret lenefesh. It says in the pasuk, "Lo titnu b'vsarchem." Okay, don't cut your body for lenefesh, for a person. Okay, but not for being upset about your boat sinking or something like that. Again, boat sinking is your items on the boat, not that you're in the boat sinking. We're talking about that you're a business person and you have a big shipment coming in and then the boat sinks. Okay, then we said, wait a minute. We also get, Rabbi Yossi had said that if you could do srita achad, you do one incision, but you do it for 5 people, you actually, because you're mourning 5 different people, you actually get 5 sets of lashes. How does he get that? Because it says lenefesh. For each nefesh that you do it, you're going to be liable. So the Gemara obviously asked, how can you learn 2 things from one? So the answer, beginning of our daf, kasava Rabbi Yossi, srita ugdida achati, uktiv hatam lemet. So now we change the first drasha. We say the way we learn that it's specifically for a dead person is because it says limit. It says now you have to say there's 2 psukim. One is seret lenefesh, okay, which is our pasuk, and we thought we were going to learn there that it's only for a dead person. But now they say the different pasuk. Dvarim chapter, okay, that was in Vayikra. This is in Dvarim chapter 14. We read this yesterday. Lo titgo dedu v'lo tasimu korcha b'einechem lemet. There we used it for the korcha pasuk. But now they say lo titgo dedu is also not to make a laceration in your body. And he says they're basically one and the same. And there, notice it says, don't do titgo dedu, and also don't make a korcha, make a bald spot, limet. That's how we know this is specifically a sin, just a transgression, just for a dead person. Okay, just as an act of mourning and not having to do with some other reason you would do this. Then you wouldn't actually get lashes for it. Amar Shmuel, hamisarek b'kli chayav. If you do this with a utensil, you're liable. Meitive, but wait, right? Normally you would say, right, a srita really in Hebrew is usually right, you scratch yourself. So usually we're talking about you make an incision with your own body. But if you do it with an implement, you're also going to be liable. It's the same thing. But now they bring a contradiction. Srita ugdida achati, elash srita biyad ugdida b'kli. Now this says, wait, one pasuk says seret, one says lo titgo dedu. They're similar. Chati here means they're not exactly the same. They're similar, But srita you do with your hand, and gedida you do with an implement. So that seems to contradict what we just said, that they're exactly the same, and therefore we can learn one from the other. If you start distinguishing between them, you could say maybe the gedida with a kli is on a maid, and the srita is not on a dead person. And then you would have to learn it from lenefesh, and then we get stuck again because then we're learning two things from the same word. So they say, no, no, no. Go back to what we said. Rabbi Yossi holds the srita gedida as a chati. Huda Amar, right? Sorry. So Ella just, sorry, I got confused for a minute. I went back too far for a minute. Let's just go back. Shmuel had said, it doesn't go yet back to Rabbi Yossi. In a second, we're going to connect to Rabbi Yossi. So go back for 1 minute. Shmuel says, "Hamisarei b'kli chayav," and then we bring a contradiction. The sritang dida chati elas shrita biyadu dida b'kli, which means srita is not with a utensil. Srita is with by hand. So how do we explain that srita could be with a utensil? You'll be liable. How can Shmuel say that? So because Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yossi, who says that sritang dida chati, they're exactly the same. Okay, so if you say they're exactly the same, then you get to two things. Number one, it's forbidden to do with a kli also, srita, and you'll get lashes if you do srita with a kli. And we learned that it's for a dead person, right? Those two things go together because once we say they're exactly the same, we can learn one from the other. But obviously, the Braita that says srita b'dida achati elish srita b'yadu b'dida b'kli doesn't think these are exactly the same, even though they use the same language. They're the same. They're very similar. Here are the differences. Okay, so there's two approaches. Are these exactly the same or are they different? Now, a Tana Kameja Rabbi Yochanan. A Tana brings a Braita before Rabbi Yochanan. Al mate bein biyad bein b'kli chayav. If it's on a dead, if you do it for a dead person and as a sign of mourning, doesn't matter whether you create an incision in your body by hand with a kli, you're going to be liable no matter what. However, alavodat kochavim. Now we're going into something totally different that we weren't talking about until now. People will worship idols by actually also harming themselves in the name of the idol worship. If you do that, biyad chayav b'kli patur. Only if you do it by hand, not if you do it with an implement. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. It says, okay, now we're going to go back to the story of Eliyahu and Achav and the showdown with the Nevi'ei Baal when they get all the prophets that are worshiping idols, right? The prophets of the idol worshipers come down and do a showdown with Eliyahu, who has God on their side. And there it says, one of the things those Nevi'ei Baal did, those idol worshiping prophets, Vayitgodedu kemishpatam b'charavot u'b'ramachim. And they did gedida, like the rules, like the way they always do it, with swords and spears. So what do you see here? It's the opposite. Gedida is done with an implement and not by hand for idol worship. So Ella, fine. Just switch it and say biyad patur b'kli chayav. Okay, mistake. We had it wrong. We flip it, and now we say, specifically with a utensil, it's forbidden, but by hand it's permitted. Now we get back to the peot harosh and the peot hazakan. So the peot harosh, up to the sideburns, machve Rav Sheshet bein pirkei reisha. Okay, Rav Sheshet showed everybody. He pointed on his head. Now this really doesn't help us. Okay, to where the different points are that you're not allowed to remove hair there by the sideburns. Now the problem is that we don't know what Rav Sheshet showed everybody. First of all, I think it's interesting that Rav Sheshet demonstrated it so everyone could see when Rav Sheshet himself was blind, which is just interesting in and of itself. But he pointed out to everyone, and that's what causes a lack of clarity among the commentaries, both on this and especially on the next line about the Peot HaZakan, where exactly these are. There's several different opinions, how low in the sideburns are you, how much you need to leave, and that's what leads to all different kinds of customs in this area. So it's very nice. He showed everybody. It's just we don't know exactly what he showed everyone. He showed the different sections and where we have the 5 corners on the beard where you can't do this. So now we have a big debate about where these 5 points in the beard are. That one is not allowed to shave. And now we're going to talk about what does it mean you're not allowed to shave. We're going to get there in 1 minute. Rabbi Eilezer, Omer im talan kulan, right? He said if you take them off in one fell swoop, you're only chayav one. Hasavar chad lav. He thought these were all part of one lav, as opposed to saying each point is like a different one, and if you take off all 5, you're going to be liable 5 sets of lashes. He says you're only liable 1. Okay, now we get to how, when the peot hazakan, okay, and there's a difference really with the sideburns. You're not allowed to take them off in any way, really. But the sideburns, but the points on the beard, you can shave them with, let's say, an electric razor, but you can't shave them with a regular razor. So the question is, and that's what the Mishnah says, Eino chayav ad shiyitlenu b'tal. Only if you take them off with a razor. Now we're going to talk about how we get this from the psukim. So to remind you of the psukim, we have a pasuk, and we've seen this sugya before. Actually, it comes up in other places. Let's see, it comes up in Kiddushin and in Nazir. Okay, so we've learned this before. It might sound familiar, might not. The pasuk by the, if you remember, there's one pasuk for the kohanim and one pasuk for everybody else. So the pasuk for the kohanim says, "Pe'at zikanam lo yigalechu." Okay, don't shave your peot of the zakan, right, the corners of the beard. In Vayikra Yutet, which is to everybody, it says, Lo tashchit et pe'at kanecha. Don't destroy. So one says shave, don't shave. One says don't destroy. So that's going to be our back and forth here, and we're going to learn one from the other because both say pe'ah. We're going to have a gzera shava between one and the other. Now, the word gzera shava is not going to appear here directly, and the gzera shava specifically, the word pe'ah doesn't appear in this sugya, but it does appear in other sugyot, and they'll make a reference further on to the gzera shava, but without actually saying which words we learn a gzera shava from. But again, if you can make a gzera shava, it means this word appears there, that word appears there. What's true for one is true for the other. So we're going to have it both fits the criteria of shaving and it fits the criteria of destroying. So now we're going to talk about different ways to remove hair. Tanu Rabbanit, pe'atz kanam lo yigalechu. Yachol afilu gilcho b'misparayim yechayav. You might have thought shaving it with scissors because people shave either with scissors or with a razor. Talmud lamar lo tashchit. When it says lo tashchit, it means don't destroy. Destroy means really from close to the, at the follicles, and you're not getting that close with a scissor. That's the whole reason why an electric razor works, because an electric shaver, because it's not lo tashchit. Right? You're not really destroying it. To destroy, you have to destroy it from really low down. Lo tashchit. Okay, so now if we're going to go with lo tashchit, yachol im liktob melakeh v'rehitni yechayav. Now melakeh is a tweezer, likely. Okay, again, there's different interpretations. And rehitni is a plane, okay, which is very similar to a razor. It's just, what's the issue? Nobody shaves that way. You don't pick out hairs one by one usually. And right, you don't use this plane implement to shave. So you might have thought you'd be chayav, Talmud lo yigalechu. It says lo yigalechu. HaKetzad, how are you going to get both giluach and hashchata? The only way you're going to get that is specifically with a razor. It fits both. This is how people shave, and it fits the destruction. Okay, whereas again, just to review, right, and that's what it says here, giluach sheyesh bo hashchata ve'omer zetal. That's tar. So we basically have, right, scissors and a razor would be a method of shaving, and malakeh and rehitni would be destroying, but also, but the razor is the only one that actually fits into both categories because a razor is also destructive because it's very close, right? It does a very close shave. So now we have to understand Rabbi Eilezer. Rabbi Eilezer omer afilu liktob malakeh v'rehitni chayav. So manafshach, either way we look at it, we're going to not understand it. Igmir gzera shava. If he learns the gzera shava, here they finally say, oh, that was based on gzera shava, in case you didn't realize. Libaitar. Well, then he should have said only a razor. If he doesn't have the gzera shava, then misparayim namilo. Then he shouldn't say, right? If he thinks it could be either shaving or destructive, then he should add scissors to the list because that at least fits the criteria of yigalechu. So what do we answer? Laolam gamri gzera shava v'kasavar hani nami giluach avde. He thinks that the malakid and the rehini could also be methods of shaving, and therefore he thinks that they are the same as the razor, as they fit both criteria. And that's the debate between them. Okay, before we move to the next Mishna, I remember that there was one other thing I wanted to say before class, which is Becky asked me after class specifically about the ger. We're going 2 days ago, sorry to go back, but it's a really good question, which is, we talked about, there was some discussion, and then Rav Ashi said, well, you can't really say what you're saying, it's not a good proof, because the ger, if you remember in the Kriyat Bikurim, Mikra Bikurim, the ger can bring Bikurim, but can't read the Mikra Bikurim because not everyone can read it. That's why they didn't put it in a list. And that was just his excuse. So, the question is what? A ger can't say, and you promised the land to my forefathers. What about all the prayers that we say that a ger says, they daven, they bench, right? We say it all the time in all our prayers. So, in fact, I looked it up, and it turns out halacha l'maaseh, the ger does say all those things and does do the mikra bikurim. We just don't hold like Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says that we don't hold by him. They comment that even so, the proof is rejected because there are some situations where people don't read the mikra bikurim, and that's why they didn't mention it there, even though the ger is not actually one of them. But just for example, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, let me just open it. Siman Kuf Tzadi Tet. It says in the laws of benching, for example, it says Ger mizamnim alav v'yachol levarech berkat hamazon ulomar al shinchat lavotenu. Okay, a ger can, you include the ger obviously in the zimun, and he can say the word shinchat lavotenu that you gave possessions to my forefather, to our forefathers, even though, right, the ger actually wasn't their forefathers. But once you become part of the Jewish people, you really are a part. And that was important to me to mention because the Gemara definitely seemed. And by the way, the Mishnah in Bikurim rules like Rav Ashi, but the Poskim changed this, which was interesting. Okay, they don't hold that way. Okay, now we're going to go to the next Mishnah, and we're going to talk about tattooing. So Hakotev Ktovet Kaka. Now, how do you do it, right? You put this ink and you make holes in your, right? There's two actions. One is the ink or whatever it is that you're using, the coloring, and the other is making incisions in your skin, right? Like holes in your skin with the needle and allowing it to seep inside. So there's two pu'ulot, the kakua, which is the holes that you're making in your skin, and the ktiva, which is the writing, right? Putting the ink on. So katav alo kiakea, kikea alo katav, if you did one but not the other, ein chayav ad shichtov kakea. My text says biado, it should be bidio. It's a two letters got confused. The order, you have to do it bidio, not biado with your own hand. Definitely not, right? If you go to a tattooing place and they do it for you, you're still liable. So you do it with ink or kohl. That was what many women used for makeup, right? It was this coloring. Okay, this color they would use for makeup. Anyway, that is also like a kind of ink. It's a blue dye. Ubechol davar, that's why it's called kohl, like from kachol. Ubechol davar shu roshem, anything that's permanent. Okay, this is sounding a lot. If you remember, there's a Mishnah in Gitin. What you have to write your get with, it has to be certain types of ink that are permanent, right? This kind of thing also. Rabbi Shimon ben, it's not actually the exact same list, although Dio is mentioned there. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Shimon Omer, Eino chayav ad shichtov sham et Hashem. Wow, that's a really interesting one. You're only liable for a tattoo, according to Rabbi Shimon, if you write the name of God in your tattoo. Shneimar, how does he get that? Well, it says in the pasuk, "Uktovet ka'aka lo titnu bachem ani Hashem." Don't put in you a tattoo. I am God. So they say, Rabbi Shimon says, from there you see it has to have God's name in it. Otherwise, it's not a tattoo that you're going to be liable for. It's a tattoo, and maybe you shouldn't do it, but you won't be liable. So Amalei Rav Acha Braid Rav Ashi, so the Rava the Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha, the son of Rava, goes right away to Rav Ashi, and the Gemara says, Ad yichtov ani Hashem mamash. He says you have to actually write the words, I am God. That's how he understands Rabbi Shimon. Okay, not just God's name, but those words that appear in the pasuk, I am God. Amalei lo. He says, no, you don't understand it properly. Kiditani bar kapara, it should be the way bar kapara learned in a braita. Eino chayav ad shichtov shem avodat kochavim. It's no, when you write the name of another God. Shene'emal, now how does he get that from the pasuk? Ktovet ka'aka lo titnu bachem ani Hashem v'lo achel. The ani Hashem comes to say, I'm your God and not anyone else. This has to do with believing in God, and this has to do with idol worship. People who were doing tattoos were doing it in the name of idols. If you do it in the name of idol worship, and then it changes a little it's a good question. What's forbidden about Ktovet ka'aka? Is it destroying your body? Is it, right, what is it exactly? But according to this interpretation, again, this is an interpretation of Rabbi Shimon's view, which is not the main view, but the Ktovet ka'aka is specifically a type of idol worship. And then it falls into a kind of a different category than you might have thought. Okay, so we have a debate whether it has to have related, this Ani Hashem, does that have part of something to do with the mitzvah? And if it does, what is it? Is it specifically writing God's name in the tattoo would be forbidden, or writing Ani Hashem? Or is it worshiping Avodah Zarah, where you're writing it in the name of another God? Okay, and then you would be writing the name of that God in your tattoo. Now we're going to move on to Rav Melchia and Rav Malkio, and you might remember them. There were two people with similar names, otherwise had nothing else to do with each other. And they each commented on one of 6 topics. And some of those topics were comments they had on a Mishnah or a Braita, and some of them were comments they had on what Emoraim said. And there was a debate about who said what. Okay, so I'm going to read, before we learn all the six cases that they're arguing about, we're going to read through the sugya and see what the issues about who said what, how we're going to have an issue about who talked about which topic. Okay, and then we'll go into what all the topics are. Amar Rav Melkia, Amar Rav Ad bar Ava. So Rav Melkia said in the name of Rav Ad bar Ava, Asur lo la'adam shiten efer mikle al gabe makato. This is a certain type of ashes that people would put to help cure wounds that they had, open wounds. And he says you can't do that because what happens if it's an open wound? You put this efer makle, it has color in it, and then it seeps into your skin. And it looks like you're imprinting a tattoo. Amar Rav Nachman Bered Rav Ika. So that's what he says about Efer Mikle. So now Rav Nachman says in the name of Rav Ika, Shfud, Shfachot, Vigumot were said by Rav Melchio. And Blorit, Efer Mikle, Ugvina were said by Rav Malkia. Okay, he's trying to make order for people. Which of these, right? It was known these six topics were discussed by either Rav Melchio or Rav Malkia. And because their names were similar, people got confused. Said these three him, these three him. Now, Rav Papa says no. Matnitin umatnita Rav Melkia, all the ones that discuss that are comments on a Mishnah or a Braita are Rav Melkia. Shmatata, the ones that were divrei Amoraim, that they commented on what a different Amora said, were all Rav Melkia. V'simanech, and how do you remember this? And here's just a mnemonic to remember. Matnita malkata. That kind of goes together. They're both like in the feminine form. The Mishnah is malkata, which means malkia, and not malkio. Okay, now, my benayu, what's the difference? Because which one's the Mishnah, which one, and a Braita, and which one's Divrei Amoraim? Ika benayu shvachot. Okay, the main one is the shvachot, okay, which we're going to learn in a minute. That one would move from the list of Rav Melchio, and it would be put on the list of Rav Malkia. Okay, right, I said that right, I hope. Right, the shvachot was on the list of Rav Melchio, and we switch it and give it to Rav Malkia. Okay. Now some people think, and we swap back Efer Mikle, and Efer Mikle goes on the other one's list, but not so clear if that's the case or not because they debate a little bit. Is this Efer Mikle on a Mishnah or is it not? Anyway, so there's a debate about, even besides the debate about who said what, there's even a debate about the second opinion, which ones actually go on which list. Is it 4 and 2 or is it 3 and 3? Okay, like do we swap 2, even though we said we only swap 1, right? But in moving 1, we have to swap the other, or not necessarily. Maybe we just move Shvachot onto the other one's list. Okay, that's all, right? To us, it doesn't seem so significant who said what, but it was important to them to know who said what opinion. Okay, so now let's go into all the cases. Okay, maybe actually let's just finish the sugya to the Mishnah so that we don't totally lose our train of thought because we're going to get onto totally different topics, and then we'll go back. Okay, so Rabbi bar Abaye kapit afilu arivda de kusilta. Now remember, we were talking about putting this Efer Mikle on your wound. So he said, even if you have a really small incision, like for the bloodletting, which is just a needle, right? Still, you can't put on the Efer Mikle because it's gonna, again, even in a small amount, it will look like you're doing a tattoo. Rav Ashi Amar, he says, I disagree with this whole thing. If you're doing it on a wound, it doesn't look like you're doing a tattoo. Everyone knows you're doing it because you have a wound there. It's very clear that there's a wound, and therefore it's not a problem at all. Okay, so we have this debate about it. Okay, now let's go back and let's go through the cases. Shvud, shvachot, and gumot. So shvud, those are the first three. Shvud is when you have it's a shipud, okay, getting up to Yom Ha'atzmaut, relevant, skewers. So skewers, if you cooked meat on it on Yantif, which you're allowed to cook, right, you roasted meat, now you take the meat off the skewer, and the skewer is disgusting. So that turns it into muktzah. Once it's muktzah, you can't move it. But again, assuming it's Rav Melchia, right? Sorry, I think it's Rav Melchio. 1 second. Don't get confused. Yeah, Rav Melchio said that this muktzah item can be moved. You can like kick it aside if it's bothering you, if it's in the way, because right, you just cooked and you have all your stuff. You're allowed to kick it to the side. It's called tiltul min hatzad, with like maybe not touching it directly, getting it out of your way. That you're allowed to do because it's unpleasant to have it in front of you. Shvachot, this is one of my favorites. This is a woman. You might remember we learned this in Ketubot. It's one of those memorable things. A woman generally had a number of shvachot that helped her, okay? Or not generally. Let's put it this way. A woman, let's start from the beginning. A woman is actually responsible for making sure certain things happen in her house. If she has a shifra, a maid, so that maid servant can do certain things. So if she has one, and it's fascinating, it's like the woman herself is responsible to do a lot, but we don't expect the shifra to do all those jobs that a woman does. So though basically you get one and you already don't have to do X. If you get two, you don't have to do X and Y. You get three, you don't have to do X, Y, and Z. If you get four, the woman doesn't have to do any work at all. Like the shvachot cover all her stuff, and the woman is exempt from any sort of responsibility in the house. But comes Rabbi Eilezer and says, no, she has to do something because otherwise she's going to sit and do nothing. And that's going to lead her to licentious behavior, like a woman who doesn't have any work ethic, anything. She has nothing to do, and that's not good. So he says she has to do something. And Rav Melchio says, I agree with Rabbi Eilezer. We paskin that way. Okay, that's the next one. Gumot. Gumot is the follicles where the hair grows. Now, we talked about shtei sa'arot, not the shtei sa'arot we talked about in the previous stuff, but shtei sa'arot for maturity. Now, if you have a follicle where the hair is supposed to grow from, but there's no hair, so that generally means, okay, there's no hair. But came Rav Melchio and said, no, if there's a follicle, it means there was hair there and the hair probably fell out. Because there's no follicle without hair, and therefore we assume that if you have two follicles there, it's a siman of bagrut. That's why I really question what it is, what exactly they mean by follicle, because it's a little confusing. Okay, then we get to the next three. The next three are blorit, efer miklet, and gvina. So efer miklet we already know. Blorit is this Roman haircut they would do, which we're not allowed to have. And not only we're not allowed to have it, but you can't cut. It was like part of they viewed it anyway as like a part of worship of idols. So if you're a hair cutter and you're cutting the hair of a Gentile, you're not allowed to cut the blorit haircut. So when you get to a certain point in the haircut, you have to stop and not continue and finish it up. It was this like rounded haircut, which seems similar, by the way, to lo takifu pe'at harosh, right? You don't want that round circle look, which is like this bloit. So now they say that what Malkia explained was how much basically are you not allowed to have, and you're not allowed to cut, and that's how much you're not allowed to cut. 3 fingers worth on each side. That's how they measure, like the width of 3 fingers. That's how much you can't cut on each side to do this blow-reed haircut. If you're doing it on somebody else, even if they're not Jewish, still you're not allowed to do it. And the gvina was a special type of gvina that they forbade. And then all the rabbis gave different explanations what it was. And for Melchio's explanation was the reason why they forbade this cheese was that the Gentiles rubbed on it pig fat, okay, lard, and therefore it was forbidden. Okay, those are the 6 issues. And again, we went to what are the differences between them. Okay, now we're going to do the next Mishnah. Nazir shaya shoteh yain kol hayom ein chayav ela achat. Now we're going to talk about a Nazir. A Nazir, there's a few different things a Nazir can do. We're going to talk about them today. So a Nazir can't drink wine. If a Nazir drinks wine all day long, how many sets of lashes do they get? Only one, because they were warned once and then they drank. Okay. But Amrula, al tishtet, v'ushotet. Actually quoted this already. If they say don't drink, and then he drinks, and then don't drink, and then he drinks, and they keep warning him again, chayava kol echad echad. So he's going to be liable for all of them. Meaning multiple sets of lashes. The topic of this Mishnah is basically multiple sets of lashes that you're going to get for 2 different reasons. We're going to see the first category are all very similar, and then the second example is going to be something different. This is where you do the same action many times, okay? And then we'll talk about the difference between the second part of the Mishnah. Now we're going to do the same thing with the other 2 things the Nazir can't do. Hayam tamei l'metim. He became impure to dead people, which he's not allowed to do. Kol hayom, all day long. Eino chayav el echad, is only liable once. Amrulo, al titama, v'hu metamei. If every time you kept walking into the cemetery and they said, don't go into the cemetery, don't go into the cemetery, chayav kol echad, you're liable for each one. Hayam megaleach kol hayom, also can't shave, right? Cut his hair. If he was shaving all day long, eino chayav el echad, he's only liable once. Amrulo, al tgalech, u'megalech. They said, don't do it, and every time he did it, chayav kol echad, each time he was warned and did the action, he'll be liable. Okay, now we're moving on to the similar type thing, but with a different isur. We're talking about kilayim, which is not wearing wool and linen together. We call that shatnez. It's a form of kilayim. We'll talk about a whole bunch of forms of kilayim today. Hayal lavush b'kilayim kol hayom. You're wearing a shatnez clothes all day long. Eino chayav el echad. You're only liable once. Amrulo al tilbash v'u poshet v'lovesh. If you say don't wear, and again, don't wear, and you keep putting it on again, right? If you take it off, put it back on, you're going to be liable each time. Now we're going to go to the second type of case in the Mishnah, turning now to Amud Bet. Yesh choresh telem echad v'chayav alav mishum shmona lavim. You could do one action, right? As opposed to this was many actions, which depending on how it happened, you might be liable once, you might be liable twice, but it was all one action that you did multiple times. This is one action you do one time, but you could be liable for 8 sets of lashes. Okay, what would it be? HaChoresh b'shor v'chamor v'hem u'kedashim v'kilayim v'kerem v'b'shvi'i v'yom tov v'kohen v'nazir b'beit hatumah. Okay, I wanted to read you the whole thing, but now we'll go through one by one. You're plowing with an ox and a donkey together, which you're not allowed to do. That's what we call don't crossbreed. Like this is not crossbreeding in terms of mating your animals, which is also kilayim, but this is using two animals who have different strengths to pull your wagon, to pull, in this case, your plowshare together. Okay, cross-yoking, thank you. So it's cross-yoking, and that's forbidden. So that's number one. Hey mukadashim. If, right, there has to be a lot of ifs here in order for you to be liable, 8 of them. If they were both sanctified animals, let's say they were both firstborns, you're not allowed to work with firstborn animals. So if they were both firstborns, that adds another 2, because you have number 1 for choresh shor v'chamor together, number 2 for using a shor that was a bechor, a firstborn, and number 3 for using a donkey that was a firstborn. So that's already 3. Kilayim bekerem. Now, if, the way we're going to explain this, although you'll see there's a bit of a debate about this, if you're plowing, what happens when you plow? The dirt, rises up in the air. And if you were in a vineyard and there were also some seeds, so there were both seeds from the vineyard and also from the vine, from the grapes, and also seeds from grains around. And while you plowed, you basically caused the dirt to kind of, right, stir up, fall down on top of the seeds, and it actually planted them. So you planted kilayim in your field at the same time. That's 4. B'shvi'it, if you did this in the Shemitah year, well, you're not allowed to plow or plant in the Shemitah year, that adds 5. Yom Tov, it was Yom Tov, you're not allowed to plow on Yom Tov, so that's 6. Kohen v'nazir b'beit hatumah, you get 7 and 8 if the person was both a Kohen and a Nazir, and when they were plowing, they went into a cemetery, and they were either plowing in the cemetery or they were, walked into the cemetery while they were plowing, so that would be 8. Hanina ben Chachinai Omer, right? This is what you call creative Mishnah, right? Let's come up with a creative case where we could do all this. Okay, so you're asking why Yom Tov and not Shabbat. We're going to get there. I mean, I don't know if that's why, but we're going to see. Okay, if it was Shabbat, it would actually be more, and we'll talk about that at the end of today's stuff. Amrula Chanina ben Chachinai Omer af halovesh kilayim. If at the time you were doing this, you were wearing shatnez, wool and linen together, you could actually, in the same action, you're wearing the clothes, you're doing all these actions, you'd be chayav even more. You'd be chayav 9. Amrulo eno Hashem. They said, no, that's not relevant here. Because that you'd be liable before you plowed and after you plowed. We're talking about the act of plowing is actually going to cause all these things to come into, right, to be forbidden. So Amar Lahem, he said to them, Af Nazir lo min Hashem. You're Nazir and Kohen, right? He doesn't say Kohen, but obviously both of them. You're Nazir and Kohen, right? The fact that you happen to be plowing next to a cemetery or in a cemetery is also a side point, which you could see debatable because you're actually plowing the land there. So it is while you're plowing, you're also in the cemetery, but one could also understand why he thinks that's also kind of similar to what you're claiming about my case. So you could see the debate there. Okay, going to the Gemara now. And now we're back to the Shatnez case. Amar Rav Bivi Amar Rabbi Yossi. Poshet v'lovesh, lovesh mamash. We're talking about where you completely take off the clothes and completely put them on again, and then you'll be liable if each time they say don't do it. What if you took out your sleeve, took your arm out of your sleeve, and then put it back in? Is that considered getting dressed again? That if somebody warns you, and then you do that, would you be liable? So here's our answer. So Rav Acha Bered Rav Ika demonstrated, just like Rav Sheshet earlier in the daf demonstrated, he demonstrated what it means to put it in, right, to take it off and to put it back on. Okay, that's really not very helpful because we don't know what he demonstrated. And in fact, the commentaries are split onto whether he meant, like the simple sounds to be like, you have to completely take it off and completely put it back on. And that's what he showed them. Or perhaps he's saying, no, this is taking on and off just by pulling my arm out of the sleeve and into the sleeve. We don't really know, so it doesn't really help us. Okay. And again, the commentaries are split on how to understand this phrase. When I say we don't really know, what's important to understand is the commentaries all claim they know, right? Everybody gives an interpretation, but that's just an interpretation, obviously. In other words, there's people who argue and say the interpretations otherwise. It's not like everybody says we don't know and puts their hands up. The commentaries say, oh, this is what it means. But someone else says this is what it means. And it leads to, us being in a place of lack of clarity. What exactly did this mean? Rav Ashi Omer, afilu lo shaha ela kedei lifshot v'lobosh chayav. If while you're wearing shatnez, they say, you're wearing shatnez, you can't wear shatnez, and you have enough time to take it off and put it back on, and you leave it on, even that you're chayav for. Okay, just leaving it on, you could be liable as long as you waited enough time that you could have theoretically taken it off and put it back on. You'd be liable because it's as if you took it off and put it on basically by leaving it on, which is interesting because we go back again to the world of lav shein bo maaseh. You didn't actually do anything, but theoretically you could be liable according to this. Yesh choresh telem. So now we're going to get back to this weird case about the 8 isurim that you could do. Amar Rabbi Yanai. So now forget about the Mishnah for a minute. Rabbi Yanai says, "B'chavura nimnu v'gamru." When we were together as a group of rabbis, we took a vote, okay, and we established that hachofer b'kilayim lokeh. Somebody who does what we were talking about from the Mishnah, right, which is you pick up the dirt, dump it back on while you're plowing, let's say, and you cover up seeds of mixed types, you can be held liable. You'll get lashes. Amar lam Rabbi Yochanan, what's your chiddush? Lav mishnatenu hizo. That's our Mishnah. What did it say in our Mishnah? Now, we never said the word chofeh b'kilayim, but it said yesh choresh talam achav v'chayav lav mishum shmona lavim. HaChoresh b'shor b'chamor v'hem k'dashim b'kilayim b'kerem. He stops at the kilayim b'kerem because that's already what he wants. Hay choresh t'b'chayav mishum kilayim hechem mishkachala. How could you have a case where you're plowing and you're liable for kilayim? Lav demachase bahade de'azil. Is it not that he covered up the dirt, right? Covered up the seeds with the dirt while he was plowing, right? That seems to be the only case. So Amarle, and therefore, what's your big chiddush that you guys all sat together and decided on this, right? There are moraim, they're not tenaim, when it's clear from the Mishnah already. So Amarle, ilav didale lach kaspa mimishkacha marganita tute. If I hadn't revealed the earthenware shard, you never would have found the pearl underneath. In other words, it's because we decided this that you read the Mishnah in that way. But otherwise, it could have been interpreted differently. So right now, that's what you think because that's what we said. Once you say you get lashes for that, you can understand the Mishnah that way. But you wouldn't necessarily have understood the Mishnah that way. And if you want to know how, well, Amar le Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, this is in the conversation with Rabbi Yana and Rabbi Yochanan. Now Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, could be it was in the same conversation, and maybe Rish Lakish piped in, it's not clear. But Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, Ilav de kilasach gaver rabba, okay, he's addressing what Rabbi Yanai said. He said if Rabbi Yanai hadn't praised you, now he didn't exactly praise him, he was being a little critical. But if he hadn't praised your interpretation and said, oh yeah, your interpretation's right. In the end, that's what he said. He said, you are interpreting the Mishnah right, but you might not have done that had I not said what I said. So if he hadn't praised you, Hava Amina, I would have explained the Mishnah differently. I would have said, Matniti Mani, who does the Mishnah accord with? Rabbi Akivahi, De Amar HaMakayem Kilayim Loke. If you walk into your field and see kilayim there, and you leave them and you don't uproot them, you get lashes. That's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. So now think about this person. I would have explained the Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva, who, by the way, would have to say, Lav she'ein bo maaseh lokina lav, right? You get lashes even for a lav that doesn't have an action associated with it. Because it's clearly not an action, you're just leaving it in your field. So Rabbi Akiva holds that if you're walking in your field, or if, for example, you're plowing with your shor and chamor and you're doing all those things, and you see kilayim and you continue to plow and you don't uproot them, then you're liable. So that could be the case where as you're plowing, you happen to notice kilayim in your vineyard or your field, and then you leave them, and then you would get lashes for that. Now, my Rabbi Akiva, where do we see Rabbi Akiva says this? Titania, haminakesh. Okay, the Braita says, first we're going to see the regular opinion, then we're going to see Rabbi Akiva. If you're weeding where there's kilayim, which is basically weeding is always to help things grow, so you're helping the mixed, the grain and the vines from growing together, or hamechape kilayim, or you cover right? You cover it with soil. You're basically just move the dirt covers it. That was our case. You get lashes. Rabbi Akiva Omer Afa Mekayem. He says, even if you leave it in your field. And there you see Rabbi Akiva's opinion. My time de Rabbi Akiva. What's the reason that he brings? Well, Ditanya, it says in a Braita, Sadcha lo tizra kilayim. Okay, don't plant in your field kilayim, mixed, again, in your vineyard, don't plant grains. Ainli ela zorea. Now from here, it says lo tizra, don't plant. That wouldn't sound like mikayem. So mikayem minayin, this is Rabbi Akiva. Where do we get that? If you leave it there, you're going to be liable. So now you have to read the whole pasuk to understand. They put some of the words in parentheses, and you'll see why in a minute. But I'll read all the words so you can see the pasuk. Talmud lomar behemtecha lo tarbiyah kilayim, which means don't crossbreed animals. Sadcha lo tizra kilayim, and your field you shouldn't plant two things together. Now, if you see, I mean, in my Gemara, there's words in parentheses, the behemtecha lo tarbiyah and tizra kilayim. Now, if you just read the middle words, which the last word of the you read it like this: kilayim sadcha lo. Now, kilayim really is, there's a comma after kilayim because it belongs to the first part of the pasuk about the animals. But in the world of drashot, you can do that. You can say, oh, I'm just going to punctuate this differently and cut off some of the words here and there and read just these words. Kilayim b'sadcha lo. Kilayim in your field, no. Which means don't keep kilayim in your field. And that's how Rabbi Akiva darshans this pasuk to teach what he wants to say, right? His opinion. Amar le ula le Rav Nachman. Now going back to our case, and this is what you asked Julie before, but he's asking a little differently. Why don't we say you get lashes for planting on Yom Tov? Because if we just said, if we interpret the Mishna to be chofeh b'kilayim and not mekayim, like they tried to say in the Rabbi Akiva, we'd always rather a Mishnah goes like everybody. So if chofeh b'kilayim is usher according to everyone, whereas mekayim is only usher to Rabbi Akiva, it's a better interpretation. And if we go with that, like Rabbi Yana and Rabbi Yochanan do, so you should say also Zoreah b'Yom Tov because you planted, right? So you should be liable for planting and liable for the plowing on Yom Tov, right? We learned on Shabbat that for every malacha you do, right, you're going to get lashes. Well, actually, it's not lashes. It's usually korban chatat, for example, but it's called chiluk melachot. Each one is viewed differently. And if you're going to talk about how many sets of lashes, so in this case, you're going to get lashes. You should get lashes for this as well. So I say you should also get lashes for Yom Tov. By the way, I'm trying to think now. Shabbat, would you get lashes? You just bring a chata? Right, would that be one of the cases where you get lashes if you do Makkot? Now I'm confused. If you do malacha on Shabbat, and let's say you don't get the death penalty, would you get lashes? I guess it depends on what you think you get lashes for. Anyway, on Yom Tov, you will get lashes. So anyway, maybe that's another reason why it's Yom Tov. But now the Gemara is addressing the difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Amalei. So the first answer is Tana B'Shir. So Makkot on Yom Tov for Zoreah, you would actually, but it just left that one out. Okay, like it had listed enough things. So Amalei Tana Katani Shmona V'Atamar Tana B'Shir. What do you mean? The Mishna's whole thing was to say we're going to come up with this crazy case where you could get 8 sets of lashes. They would just leave one out and say, oh, it's really 9, but we're going to talk about 8. That's a bad answer. So, Amarle, Amar Rabba, Yesh chiluk melachot b'Shabbat ve'ein chiluk melachot b'Yom Tov. You're not going to get separate lashes on every malacha on Yom Tov. You're only going to say that we view each malacha as a separate entity for laws of Shabbat, but not for laws of Yom Tov. Okay, this is going to be a question. Okay, but right now that's what he says. Amarle adate says that's a good explanation for our Mishnah. Right, that works well. And then we understand, again, this supports Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai said that's how we read the Mishnah, right? And that also supports, if you read the Mishnah that way, and it supports Rabbi Yanai's decision when they got together and they said, Chofeh b'kilayim asur, and you can see that from the Mishnah. So now, Eitiv Abai says, and with this we're going to end, Ein chiluk melachot b'Yom Tov. Who says there's no chiluk melachot on Yom Tov? Look at this. Hatznan, hamivashel, it says in the Mishnah, hamivashel gid b'chalav b'Yom Tov. If you take the gid anasheh, which is the sciatic nerve, which is forbidden to eat, and you cook it up with milk on Yom Tov, again, one of these good cases, ve'achalo, and you ate it, lo kechamesh, okay, you're going to get 5. Why? Lo kemishum ochel gid. You ate the gid anasheh, which is forbidden. Lo kemishum mevashel b'Yom Tov shelo l'tzorech. You're cooking something on Yom Tov not for the purpose of Yom Tov because you can't even eat it. Forget about it. You can't eat on Yom Tov. You're only allowed to cook on Yom Tov. You need for Yom Tov. Lo ken mishum v'shel gi b'chalav, milk and meat together. Lo ken mishum ochel basar v'chalav, and you ate it, so you ate milk and meat that you cooked together. And lo ken mishum havara, and you made a fire to cook it with. So now what do we have here? Mivashel and Yom Tov and Mavir b'Yom Tov. Those are two malachot. Im ita mishum avara lo mechayev. And if you were right, you wouldn't be chayav on avara if there's no chiluk malacha on Yom Tov. Ta'i chayav le mishum b'shulo, because you're already allowed to get mishum b'shul. And wait for tomorrow to see the answer. So what did we do today? We started with Shrita. We talked about, is there a difference Shrita and Gedida? Is one biyah, one bikli? Right. We also talked about how we learned the different drashot, right? Because we ended with learning two things from one pasuk. How can you get that? You get it from Gedida. That's if you assume they're all one and the same. And then what about the kli, the yad? Then we talked about the different payot, where the payot are, and the zakan and the face, and why it's only specifically a razor, and why Rabbi Eilezer disagrees and thinks with certain other implements as well. Then we got to the tattooing, when exactly you're liable for tattooing, what has to happen. We got to the 6 things of Rav Malkiah, and that was because of this Ephraim Miklei. You put it on a wound. It looks like, it's not really a tattoo, but it looks like a tattoo. It's forbidden. Then Rav Ashi, you didn't really think it was, but Rav Malkiah thought it was. Then we got to this case of the Nazir, where you could get multiple sets of lashes for one action if you got warned in between, but you could do it many times and actually not get only one if you weren't really warned in between. And then we had you could do one action and have multiple sets of lashes, and that was the choresh talam echad, and you did it in all sorts of ways, right? If all those things were there, you would actually get 8 sets of lashes. And then we talked about and the kilayim also, and then talk about what does mean taking off and putting back on, that you'd be liable for wearing the same clothing. If you put it back on and took it off, would just taking out the sleeve be enough? Which we didn't really end up with a clear answer to that. And then we talked about this chofeh b'kilayim, and does it come out from our Mishna? Is that the only way to read the Mishna? Could you read the Mishna some other way? Why they prefer that way? And from there, the question, well, then you should be chayav zoreah also, but in chiluk malacha b'yom tov, and is that really so? And that's how we ended our daf, with that question. So with that, we'll finish for today. And I'll look up the Shabbat issue that I got confused about. Are there lashes on Shabbat also? Is that specifically why they talk about Yom Tov? So I'll check that out for tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day and Chodesh Tov.